Hey, good morning. I am really glad to be here worshiping with you guys today. It's an exciting time of year. This is like the last weekend before the crazy, right? Like summer is just around the corner. Next weekend's Memorial Day weekend. That's when everybody's schedule seems to just kind of go in a million different directions. And so I'm excited to gather together this morning and to dive into the Word and to worship this morning. Before we get too far into it, though, I know Mark already mentioned this. I want to just mention it one more time. Our starting point class, if you're fairly new to Gateway, or maybe you've even been around for a while, but you've never actually placed membership, or maybe you just kind of have some questions about the church, about what we believe and how we're structured and things like that. Man, starting point is a great place for that, so I'd encourage you to stick around after service for starting point if you want. It'll be right through these doors. There's a classroom just out there. We'd love to have you join us. We have lunch provided for you. We've got childcare provided, all of that. So please join us after service. It'd be fantastic. That being said, let's pray real quick, and then we'll jump into what we're talking about today. God, we love you. We thank you so much for Jesus more than anything. God, thank you for the opportunity that we have to gather together and to celebrate you and everything that you have done for us. God, thank you for sending Jesus into this world for us. And so, God, we just ask that you'd be with us now as we dive into your word, as we look at the life of Jacob. Again, God, would you open our minds and our hearts and our ears to what you have to say this morning. God, we love you. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. All right, now, if you know me, you know this about me likely. I love sports. I really love sports. And what you may not know about me, though, is that throughout my life, I've played on a whole lot of different sports teams. I was really involved in sports all the way from elementary school up through high school and even into college. And I credit that for a lot of things that it has taught me in life. Is that being a part of teams, I've learned so much just about life, just valuable life lessons that have shown up time and time again. Things like hard work, the value of hard work, and learning responsibility, and the idea of setting goals, whether those are individual goals or team goals, or accountability, being accountable to the other people that I'm working with and trying to accomplish things with. All of those things have kind of contributed to making me who I am through sports. But another thing that came through my involvement in sports is I'm a very competitive person. And I've mentioned this before, that I am very, very competitive. By competitive, I mean this. I hate to lose. I really hate to lose. I don't even let my kids win at games at our house. No, not Uno, not memory, Connect Four, foosball, none of it. Not having it, and not letting them win. That's just me. I'm an extremely competitive person. I hate losing. And the reason I hate losing is I don't like the idea that me and maybe my teammates along with me, I don't like the idea that we can work our tails off and things still may not turn out in our favor. I don't like the idea that we could do everything right to the best of our ability and things still may not go the way we hope for them to. Fortunately, as I was kind of growing up, going through elementary school, middle school, high school, as I was thinking back over it this week, I don't think I was ever on a losing team. It was just one of those things that the teams that I was on, not because of me in particular, but just I was lucky enough to be on these teams that some were better than others, but I don't think we ever had a losing season until I got to college. I got to college, and I've played a lot of different sports growing up. I played soccer when I was in little, elementary school. I played basketball and football and track and all these different things. Got to college and decided that I would go out for the soccer team. And I had not played soccer since I was in elementary school. I didn't play in middle school or high school, but thought, you know what, I'm going to go out for soccer in college. The reason I wanted to do it was because I had a lot of friends on the team, and I knew that they must be pretty good because the year before, they had won the regional championship. And so my sophomore year of college, I decided I would go out. I made the team, and it should have been a clue that there was no tryout. It should have been a clue to me that they just let anybody come on the team. As a matter of fact, they were just happy to have enough people to field a team. I could have never played soccer before in my life and made this team. And let me tell you something. We were horrible. Like, I don't mean like we were close to 500, like we lost, maybe we lost a little more than we won. No, we lost way more than we won. I played soccer for 2 years in college. 2 years combined, I think we won 6 games. I think. That might be a stretch. Like we were not good. And so you can imagine for me, being an incredibly competitive person, those seasons, man, they were painful. I hated those seasons because I hated losing. But now, as an adult, I look back and I can see that really, of all the teams that I've been a part of, those 2 teams were my favorite teams that I've ever been a part of. It wasn't a great experience. We lost a lot, but I enjoyed those teams so much. I enjoyed those teams because we had a ton of fun together. Like as a group of guys, we just got along really well. We enjoyed being together. And so going on trips to go play games and do all practices and all that stuff, it was fun. It wasn't work. It was a lot of fun. Some of my best friends to this day, I've built lifelong friendships through those 2 teams in particular. Guys that I know that I can call up and even if we haven't talked for a long time, it'll be like we just kind of pick up right where we left off. It's those kinds of close relationships that came out of those teams. I love those teams. They were some of the best teams that I was on because there was incredible spiritual growth that happened on those teams. I went to a Christian college. Supposedly everyone that went to my school was a Christian. And so when we would go on trips, a lot of times we'd be laying in our beds in hotel rooms or in different dorms where we're staying overnight and things like that. And we would have spiritual conversations. And it was just this incredible time in my life where I was learning and I was growing so much. I loved those teams because I always knew that there was more to life than what was happening on the field. That more than all the losing that was happening on the field, I knew there was so much more behind it. I gained so much from those losing seasons, and honestly, I wouldn't trade them. I wouldn't trade them for the world. Because God had so much more in store for me and for the other guys on the team than just the product that we saw on the field. But I didn't see it at the time. And it was frustrating. I don't know anybody that really enjoys losing. Some people handle it better than others. I don't know that anybody really enjoys it though. But prolonged periods of losing are particularly difficult. Not just in sports, but in life. Is that maybe you've gone through times in life where you just feel like you're losing at life. Like I'm not talking about isolated events. I'm talking about when all the events pile up at once. Like everything from, you have a job loss to you're going through marital issues. You get a diagnosis. You experience some kind of tragedy in your life. There's some kind of relational conflict going on. There's financial struggles, but it all hits at once. And it's not just a losing event. It's not just a bad thing that happens. It's a losing season. It's a prolonged time where it just feels like nothing is going right. Sometimes they become seasons where you don't just lose, but you actually find yourself in that season giving away or walking away or maybe even throwing away some things, throwing away relationships. The losing season can leave you with relationships. We can leave you with people that you don't talk to anymore. And sometimes you lose opportunities, or you give away, or you throw away opportunities. You get so depressed in those seasons sometimes that you miss your shot. You miss an opportunity, or maybe you miss time with somebody. Right? And sometimes you can even give away your faith in these seasons. A season of losing can cause you to question your faith, can cause you to abandon your faith. And you're here today, I'm assuming, most of you, because you've gone through a season like that. Some of you are here today because you're going through a season like that. And you're here and you've kind of limped in here today, whether you're in the room or you're watching online. And for some of you, today is like the last shot. That something's been going on and you're giving it one more. You're giving it one more shot, but you're just like, God, I don't know if I can continue doing this. You're in the right place. We've been going through this series called Faith with a Limp. It's a series for people with broken faith. It's a series for people whose faith feels like you don't belong in a group like this. It's a series for people whose faith and their belief and their practices sometimes don't always exactly line up. This is a series for talking about the kind of faith that regularly falls short, and yet it's a faith that God continues to show up for in our lives over and over and over. We've been looking at an example of what this kind of faith looks like in the life of a guy named Jacob. Jacob was raised to know God. He was told that God would do some amazing things in his life and through him and for him. But yet Jacob is a guy who consistently struggles to live out the faith that he claims. God has promised to be with him, and yet it's a struggle for him to trust. And so we've been looking at his life, this Jacob, this guy who's consistently struggled with his faith. And today we're going to pick things right up where we left off last week, actually, at the end of Genesis chapter 29. If you got a Bible, go ahead and open it up, turn there. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time kind of reviewing Jacob's story up to this point because we're pretty far into it, and there's a lot of material to cover there. So if you're just showing up today, like this is the first time you've been able to be a part of this series, I'd encourage you to go back online and check out some of the previous weeks of this. But in Genesis 29, like I said, we've covered a lot of ground so far, and today in particular, we're going to be covering a lot of ground. And so as we move through the really 2+ chapters of the Bible that we're going to be looking at today, I'm not going to be reading all of it. A lot of times we'll kind of walk through very slowly a passage. Today's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to do a whole lot of summarizing, so I would encourage you, whether it's while I'm talking today or just maybe later in the week when you get home, I'd encourage you to go back and read through this section and really move through it a little bit slower, pick through it a little bit. But for today, we're going to be moving fairly quickly and just kind of hitting on some of the important things that we see along the way. So to kind of set things up, okay, God has promised Jacob that he is going to be with him and that he's going to bless him. He's going to give him descendants. And so Jacob is like, cool, if you're going to do that, then I will worship you. And so he says, but if I'm going to have descendants, then I'm going to need a wife. And so he goes off to get a wife. He goes to a man named Laban, who's actually his uncle. And he says, hey, I want to marry your daughter. I want to marry your daughter, Rachel. And then we talked about this last week. Laban cheats him. He tricks him, just as Jacob has done so many times throughout his life to other people. And so at the end of it, Jacob ends up with both Rachel, who he wanted to marry, and her older sister Leah. He ends up with 2 wives, one who he loved, one who he didn't, one who he wanted, one who he didn't. And he begins to live life with them and their 2 maidservants in this weird, odd dynamic of a family. And he begins playing favorites. And as we go through this, the couple chapters today, as we look through this and you begin to see some of the things that everyone goes through here, you're going to notice very quickly that this is a losing season for everyone. That these are some of the most difficult years of Jacob's life, not just for him, but for everyone around him. Laban has cheated him into marrying both of his daughters. Jacob has agreed to work for Laban for 14 years because at this point in his life, Jacob was so poor he didn't have what would have been considered like a bride price to pay to the dad, which was custom at the time. And so he's got to work it off, basically. And so Jacob's in the middle of this first losing season of his life. That things had been good, and then they were terrible. And he's right in the middle of all the terrible. And as you're going to see, like I said, this is a losing season for everybody. But everybody in this story responds to that losing season a little bit differently. They respond to this prolonged time of loss and hurt and pain a little bit differently. And as we go through it, it's going to reveal a lot about themselves, but really it's going to reveal a lot about us. And so as we go through this and we talk about the different people involved, I want you to be looking for yourself, watching for yourself, and specifically looking for your coping style. What's your go-to move when you go through these seasons of loss? Not just when you go through like a tough event, but when you go through a season where it's thing after thing after thing and it just piles up and it feels like nothing is going right. What's your go-to? How do you respond to seasons of loss? And as we do that, we'll see what does this possibly reveal about you. So let's pick it up. Genesis chapter 29, verse 31. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. So like we mentioned, Jacob loves Rachel more. He's playing favorites, and because that worked so well for him in his previous family growing up where that was also a problem. But he continues doing it. And I got to point this out. What a lonely life for Leah. Like, think back to last week. Her dad had knowingly sold her for 7 years of labor, and he sold her to a man that he knew didn't want her, didn't love her. And now she's married to him, and he still doesn't love her, doesn't want her. This is Leah's losing season. But God sees her, and he blesses her with not just a son, with several sons. And as this happens, as she begins to have children with Jacob, you begin to see what her go-to move is when she goes through a season of loss. Genesis 29, verse 34, we can see that this is her, she's going to have a son. It says this, again, she conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Now at last my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. So she named him Levi." This is her third son. That name Levi, it means unity. It means joined. And so basically what she's doing is she's saying, I want you to look at why she has named him that. She says, finally, my husband will love me. She had named her first 2 sons, who had come prior to this, she had named them similar things. She had named them things having to do with her desire, her want to be loved by her husband, or the reality. She named one about the reality that she was unloved by Jacob. All Leah wants is for Jacob to love her. And in this, we see her doing what so many of us do when we go through seasons of loss. Leah is reaching for relationships. She's determined that she's going to change her season of loss by fixating on a relationship, by fixating specifically on her relationship with Jacob. And so she ties her first 3 sons, she ties their identity to her striving for acceptance from her husband. And we do this all the time. And we do this especially when we're in a losing season. We think that things are out of control, so let me grab control of this area. Really, let me grab control of this particular person. And our relationship with someone, one individual in particular usually, it becomes our gauge for how the rest of life is going. That as long as this relationship is good, things must be good. And if this relationship is bad, things must be bad. A lot of times for us, this is a romantic relationship. It can be your relationship with your spouse. It can be your relationship with the person that you're dating. But it's not only romantic relationships. This can be any relationship. Sometimes it's our relationship with our kids. That if our kids are doing well, we assume that we're doing well. And if our kids are doing bad, well, then we're doing bad. That we tie what kind of season we're in life. We interpret that through what is happening with our kids. Or maybe it's not our kids. Maybe it's a particular friend. Or maybe it's our relationship with our boss. But regardless, many of us, just like Leah, when we go through seasons of losing, when we go through seasons where it's difficult thing after difficult thing after difficult thing, we reach for relationships. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, Leah should want to be loved by her husband. I would hope that would be something she wants to experience. You should want to have good relationships with people. You should want to have good relationship with your spouse and your kids and your boss and your friends and your neighbors. Like, those should all be important things. But what Leah is doing here, and what we do, is we reach for something and we settle for something that is less than God wants for us. Look at how Leah's fortune changes as soon as she stops doing this, as soon as she stops reaching. Verse 35, she conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "This time I will praise the Lord." So she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children. Judah means praise. She shifts her focus away from her desire to be accepted and loved by her husband, and she shifts that focus to praising God, even in the midst of this difficult season for her. Nothing has changed. She's not suddenly loved by her husband. She just decides she's going to praise God instead. Her season of loss at this moment has actually ended. She doesn't even know it yet, but it has. This son, Judah, her fourth-born son, he's going to become the next head of the family. He's going to be the one through whom Jesus is going to be a descendant of. He is going to be like the gateway to so much blessing for all of the people of the world. That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. That Leah, the unloved, the unwanted wife, will later in life, when she passes away, she's going to be the one who is buried in the family tomb. Like she's going to be the one who is given the honor of resting with all the other great leaders of their family. She's buried in the family tomb. Rachel, the wife that Jacob loves, she gets buried along the side of the road. Leah becomes the one who has this incredible honor. She didn't know it at the time. But before we get that far, before we skip ahead to like they're passing away and all that, before we get that far, we see not just Leah going through a losing season, but we see Rachel going through one too. That she goes through a losing season and she reaches for something that reveals where her trust is as well, but it's not relationships. She reaches for something else. Look at Genesis 30, beginning in verse 1. When Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." Jacob became angry with her and said, "Am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children?" Then she said, "Here is Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her so that you can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her." She says, "Give me children or I will die." That sounds like really extreme to us, maybe a little dramatic to us, but at the time she's living it, she's not wrong. Like, she's not wrong. Sons were considered your protection. They were considered like an insurance policy almost, that if something happened to your husband and he were to die early and you were left alone as a widow, you were to have sons who would then come around you, other family members to come and to care for you. And so a woman who didn't have sons and who something happens to her husband, well, she was basically as good as dead. With no means to provide for herself. Women in this culture at the time couldn't own property. She would have no means of income. And so she doesn't want that. Rachel knows that this is a possibility, doesn't want that to happen, so she hatches a plan. She has not been able to have children for whatever reason. She doesn't even know. She hasn't been able to, and so she hatches this plan, and she gives her servant, Bilhah, to her husband, Jacob. Now, it seems pretty messed up. Right? That sounds pretty gross, but it's actually really common in the ancient world. That there was a common practice that people who followed other gods, not Yahweh, but people who followed other gods often did with this, where they would provide a servant to their husband who could then hopefully have a child with them, and that child would not be considered the servant's child, it would be considered the wife's child, and it would be raised as if it was the wife's child. It is actually something you've seen in Jacob's own family history. His grandpa, Abraham, and his grandma, Sarah, they did something very similar with the birth of Ishmael, if you're familiar with that story. Basically, this practice is how people who don't follow the living God provide for themselves. God has made it clear, he did it through Abraham's story, that followers of his, this is an unnecessary step. They don't need to do this. They can trust that God is going to provide for them. But Rachel here, she reveals where her trust really lies. But instead of reaching for relationships like Leah does, Rachel, she's reaching for resources. See, this is Rachel's go-to move. When she's in a season of losing, she reaches for resources. Some of you, that's your go-to move. That when you feel like you're losing in life, when you're going through a losing season, you reach for resources. You think the present is crazy right now, so I'm going to secure the future, and I'm going to dive into work, and I'm going to chase that promotion, or I'm going to start looking for a better job, or a second job, or maybe your attitude is, I'm not going to, I can't just let life happen to me, that I got to be active, I've got to make something happen. But what we see in Rachel's life when she does this is this kicks off this wild competition between Rachel and Leah. And so for the next several verses 7 through 24, you see some crazy things happen. So Jacob has already had 4 sons with Leah. He has 2 more with Rachel's servant Bilhah. Leah sees this happen. She said, no, you're not going to upstage me. So she gives her servant to Jacob, and he has 2 more sons with her. It's this crazy competition. Pretty messed up, honestly, when you stop and think about it, that Jacob's just going along with this. Like, just letting his wives just pass him around, however. Like, that's really weird. But he's doing it. It continues on like this. Rachel's trying, and she's still not having children. And so Rachel, again, reaches for resources. One of Leah's sons, Reuben, comes in from a field, and he has some mandrakes. Mandrakes are this fruit that is common in the ancient Near East. And any kind of fruit in the ancient Near East that had seeds inside the fruit was considered either an aphrodisiac or it was considered to have some kind of like medicinal properties that would increase fertility. And so Rachel sees that Reuben has these, and basically she sells Jacob for the night to Leah. Like, says, hey, he can go with you tonight if you give me these mandrakes, because she's reaching for resources. She's trying to do anything she can that might help her have children. And so she does this, and basically sells Jacob for the night. And it goes the other way. It doesn't go the way that Rachel hopes that it will. Leah ends up having 2 more sons and a daughter with Jacob. The daughter, Dinah, is a very heartbreaking story that we'll look at in a couple weeks. But finally, after years of trying, Rachel, she has a son. She names him Joseph. That name Joseph, it literally means Jehovah will add. It is because Rachel reaches for resources. So she names her child Jehovah will add, because she's already looking forward to more. She's already looking forward to what God has planned next, or what she might be able to get for herself next. See, when you reach for resources in life, it's never enough. Leah has 6 sons and 1 daughter. Bilhah, 2 sons. Zilpah, 2 sons. Rachel, 1 son. And so we get to the point where there are 11 sons, 1 daughter. But Rachel's not the only one who's been reaching for resources in this season. You'll see what happens next. Laban gets in on it too. But this isn't Laban's go-to move when he's losing. He does it, because we all do a variety of things sometimes. But this isn't his go-to. We'll see what his is in a little bit. But let's look at chapter 30, verse 25. It says, after Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, send me on my way so I can go back to my homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you. So Rachel has a son, and Jacob's he's ready to leave. It was really common for daughters, once they'd been married off, it was common for the husband and wife to stay as a part of that father's household until the wife reached a point where she had her first child, because that was when she was considered to be provided for. It is that was the point where the dad could basically release them and say, okay, no matter what happens to your new husband, you have a son now, and so you are taken care of. And so Rachel has a son, and Jacob's like, all right, I finished my 14 years of service. We got to this point. We're good. It's time to go. And so Jacob is ready to head off. Laban realizes that he's had a pretty sweet deal for these 14 years with Jacob working for him, and he doesn't want the gravy train to end. And so he asks Jacob to stay and to continue working for him. Basically, he even puts it out there. He basically says, hey, name your price. What do you want me to pay you? And Jacob says, well, how about this? I'll look after your sheep. I'll continue to look after your sheep, but I want you to do something. I want you to give me any of the sheep that are speckled or spotted or dark color. And Laban, you can have all the white ones. Just give me the dark colored ones. So white was like considered the dominant gene. It was the dominant trait. Is that everyone wanted white. They wanted the white sheep because they were the ones that tended to reproduce more. And so when Jacob throws this out there and says, hey, just give me the spotted speckled ones, those are the ones that were considered weaker. They were the ones that people didn't want as much. And so Laban's like, yeah, like that's a sweet deal. I will totally do that. And so he agrees to it pretty quickly. It's a no-brainer. But Laban, as we saw last week, Laban's a shady dude. He is a trickster. He is a deceiver, just like Jacob. And so look at what he does. Verse 35. That same day, so the same day he makes this agreement with Jacob, that same day he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark-colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks. Now, this is really shady. This is really terrible. See, when he's faced with the idea of possibly losing his daughters, Laban tips the scales even more in his favor. Not only does he get Joseph to work for this incredibly deal that's going to benefit Laban a ton, but then he kind of fixes things even more, and he gives all the sheep that should go to Jacob, and he gives them to his sons immediately, so that Jacob only has a flock with white sheep. And so the only chance that any of these sheep are going to produce the kind of sheep that Jacob will get to keep for himself, as if two sheep who are both carrying this recessive gene mate with each other, and even then there's only a 25% chance that their offspring is going to be one of the ones that Jacob could keep. This is an incredibly lucrative deal for Laban, and he just ups the chances for himself even more. But Jacob's a deceiver too. Verses 37 to 42, you see Jacob, it tells of this really weird breeding strategy that Jacob implements with the sheep. That basically he's trying to pull the strings to have things work out in his favor somehow. Now, there's a lot of debate over how effective what he does actually is. There's actually some good research saying that this is a legit way of breeding that could actually work. But regardless of it, here's the results. This is what happens. Genesis 30, verse 43. In this way, the man, Jacob, grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. Basically, Jacob gets stupid rich. He gets crazy rich. And he gets so rich, in fact, that Laban's sons get jealous. Chapter 31, verse 1. Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. Then the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. So Jacob's noticing that Laban and his son's attitudes have kind of shifted towards him. And so God gives him the green light to finally go home. This is what Jacob has been waiting for. For 20 years, he has been with Laban, serving to be able to marry his daughters, serving to watch over his flocks. And finally, God has said, okay, you can go now. So he calls together his wives. He calls together Leah and Rachel and explains to them why it's time to go, and including he tells them that God was actually the one that told him about that crazy breeding strategy that he ended up using. And look at their response. This is really interesting. Genesis 31, beginning in verse 14. Then Rachel and Leah replied, do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate? Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us. Surely all the wealth that God took away from our father belongs to us and our children. So do whatever God has told you to do. Jacob has worked 14 years as the bride price for his two wives. Typically, that money would be set aside for the father. It would be something that the father would gather together, and he would set it aside so that when the wife and her new husband were finally able to leave the family and to go off on their own, he would then return that money back to his daughter as a wedding gift. It is a way to, again, to provide for her in case something were to happen to her husband, that she would have some financial means to care for herself. And Laban doesn't do that. He's blown it all. All that money, 14 years, and he's just spent it. And so Leah and Rachel understandably are like, yeah, let's go. Let's get out of here. And then Rachel does her move again. She does her go-to move. Look at verse 19. Then when Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. Now, why is this a big deal? A lot of people think that this is like a religious thing, and it kind of is. I mean, they are called gods, but reality, what's actually happening here is that those gods were not so much about worship as they were about inheritance. We'll put a picture up that kind of shows you an example of what these gods would have been like. These aren't the exact ones, but these are very similar. Is that the word in Hebrew is teraphim, and these are what teraphim gods were. They were these little statues that represented ancestors, and they weren't so much for worship. That was an element of it, but their main purpose was actually to act more like land deeds. Like, see, Laban is a rich guy. He's not as rich as Jacob is, because Jacob's wealth has grown like ridiculous. But he has a lot to lose. And so when Rachel steals his gods, it's like she's basically leaving him with no way of proving that all that wealth that he has, all that land, all the sheep, all the stuff, he has no way of proving that it's actually his. Again, Rachel is reaching for resources. She is trying to provide for herself. So Laban, understandably, gets angry, comes after him, catches up, launches into this speech. Verse 26, then Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done? You've deceived me. You've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of timbrels and harps?" Come on, like he's really going to do that. Verse 28, "You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You have done a foolish thing. I have the power to harm you. But last night the God of your father said to me, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.'" He's basically saying, hey, I could kill you, but I'm not going to. Now, verse 30, "Now you have gone off because you longed to return to your father's household." And then he reveals the real reason he's there. "But why did you steal my gods? Why did you steal my gods?" He's trying to sound caring, but the whole reason he's there is these gods. It actually reveals where his trust is when he has been going through a season of losing. He's lost a lot of money, and Laban is out to restore what was lost. Some of you, that's your go-to. That you've reached a place in life where you look back and you liked how things used to be, and you long to go back there. You wish you could go back to that time when maybe you had a little bit more money, or that time when the kids were home, or when the kids wanted to be around a little bit more, or you wish that you could go back to the time when life was just a little bit simpler, or when you were in a place where you had a little bit more friends, or a little bit more support, or you wish that you could go back to a job that you used to have that you never should have quit, and you look back and you go, oh, why did I do that? It was so dumb. And you try so hard to restore, or sometimes to recreate what is in the past. And it was better when life was simpler. It was better when we lived there. It was better than when this happened and this and this and this. The idea is that something back then was better. And if you could just go back, well, then life would be better. And you're so focused on going back that you miss what God is doing right now. Laban accuses Jacob of stealing his gods. Jacob has no idea this has happened. So he says, hey, you go ahead, find them. And he lets Laban basically just tear the place apart, looking everywhere for these gods. Rachel tricks her dad into, she hides them in a way that he's not able to find them. He doesn't even want to look in this place. So then Jacob, at the end of all of it, he goes to Laban, hey, you didn't find them, did you? And then Jacob just begins to rip into him. He begins naming all the different ways that Laban has wronged him over the years. He says that Laban has taken advantage of him. But even when Jacob was working for as a shepherd, Jacob's like pointing out, like, I was good to you. Like if something happened to a sheep, if a sheep got killed, I would just replace it with one of my own. I didn't tell you that you had lost anything. I just gave you one of mine. Like I was generous in doing that. He points out that Laban has changed his wages 10 times. In those 6 years where he has worked for Laban, Laban changed his wages 10 times, and those were not cost of living increases. Like imagine, it's hard enough for us when our employer comes to us and says, hey, we're going to have to cut your pay a little bit. It's hard to go through that once. 10 times in 6 years. Jacob's gone through this. But then at the end of his speech, at the end of his list of all the horrible things that Laban has done to him, Jacob points something out that everyone else has missed. That everyone else who's been going through a losing season in this story, that Leah and Rachel and Laban, something that they have all missed. Look at verse 42. Jacob says this, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you. For as shady as Jacob has been in his life, and he has been one of the worst, for as shady as he has been, even in these chapters today that we've read, and in allowing his wives to just kind of pass him around like a lucky charm, Jacob has begun to see God moving in his life. In fact, he is the only person in this season of losing who has even been looking for that. This is the first time in Jacob's life that we see Jacob living out significant life change. Everyone else in this situation has been looking and reaching for relationships and resources and looking to restore the past, looking to restore what was lost, but Jacob has actually been trusting God. Through it all, he knew that not only had God seen him, but that God had actually been working in the midst of this losing season. We'll go backwards a little bit and look again at this speech that Jacob gave to Rachel and Leah when he gathered them together to first tell them, like, hey, we're gonna leave, that God told us to go. Look back at chapter 31, beginning in verse 5. Jacob speaking, he said to them, I see that your father's attitude toward me is not what it was before, but the God of my father has been with me. See, Jacob's noticed something, is that oftentimes for us in life, when things get hard, when we go through a losing season, we reach for relationships, but God gives presence. Is that we reach for relationships around us. Who are the people in my life that I can latch on to help kind of steady the waters, and that as long as I know that this relationship is going well, then I can assume that things are good. And in the midst of all of that, God is just saying, look, I'm here. It's good that you want relationship. Have it with me, because I'm here. We set our sights so low. But Jacob, at least here, he knew that God was with him in the middle of it all. He goes on in verse 6. You know that I've worked for your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. It's so common for us to reach for resources. To say, I'm going to get the money, or I'm going to get the things, I'm going to get the material things that I need to make my life better. But Jacob knows that when we reach for resources, God gives protection. It doesn't mean that you're never going to lose in life. It doesn't mean that God's going to protect you from everything that could possibly go wrong. That's why you're in a losing season, because things haven't gone wrong. But what we need to recognize is that it's just that. It's a season. And it lasts for a while, but it doesn't last forever. Then Jacob goes on in verse 8. If he, talking about Laban, if he said the speckled ones will be your wages, then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said the streaked ones will be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given them to me. Jacob knows that where Laban was wanting to restore what he had lost, when we reach to restore what was lost, God provides. And God doesn't always provide everything that we want, but He does provide everything that we need. And it may not look the way we want it to, but God takes care of us. So as we wrap up this morning, man, where are you in this story? Are you Leah? Is that your go-to? So when you go through that difficult season, you begin to reach for relationships and you latch on to someone or maybe a small group of people and you say, as long as I can control this relationship and things are good here, then everything else must be okay. And if this relationship's bad, then everything else must be bad. Do you settle for that? It's important to invest in relationships, but do you stop there? Or maybe you're more like Rachel, and resources are your thing. That when life spins out of control and you don't feel like you know what's going to happen, you try to secure the future. And you try to get more money, or you try to get more resources, or you try to get the things that you need or the things that you want, that you think that those things are going to level everything out and bring you out of that losing season. Or maybe you're Laban, and you are consumed by the need to restore something that you feel like you lost. And so often in life, we are so quick to reach for control. We're so quick to reach for control when we feel like we are losing at life, but it doesn't work. You're always going to feel like you're coming up short. Even if you get the thing that you want, you're not going to be satisfied because you're always going to think that better is just around the corner. Most of us can find ourselves here, that we're either Leah or Rachel or Laban. But what if we could be like Jacob? And that sounds weird because Jacob messes up a lot. But what if in this situation, in these losing seasons in our lives, what if we could be like Jacob, to know that in the middle of all the muck and all the mess and all the problems, that some of them we've created for ourselves and some are because people have just come into our lives and messed things up for us? What if you could know in the middle of all of that God has seen you? And what if in the middle of all of it, you can be aware of God's presence with you, His protection, and His provision in the middle of your losing season? In fact, what if the losing season that you have been in, or that you're in right now, what if it's exactly where God wants you to be so that He can get your attention and call you back to Him? What if it's what He is using right now to show you that He is with you, that you are safe with Him, and that He has a future for you? What if it's not you're reaching for control, but what if it is God's grace that is sufficient for you? What if it's His power that's made perfect, not in your grabbing, not in your reaching, but in your weakness? That's what God does. The best example of that is Jesus on the cross. That we all needed to have our relationship with God restored, and we couldn't do it. And so Jesus, He looks at our weakness and He says, I got that. So if you feel like you're in a losing season, I want to challenge you this morning to do something. It's just really practical for the rest of this week, just every day. Just point out one thing to yourself. Look for God's presence or provision or protection toward you. And just write it down. Just that one thing. Just one thing a day. Write it down. Or maybe you take a step even beyond, more than just writing it down, but what if you begin to trust God's presence and protection and provision, that is with you? Maybe it's for the very first time. Like for some of you, you need to remind yourself of something that you knew once or that you have known at different times throughout your life. And some of you need to take that step to do it for the first time. And to say, okay, God, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to trust that you're with me and that you're providing and that you're protecting. See, in the middle of our losing season, God has seen you. Are you looking for Him? Let's pray. Father, we love you. We thank you for Jesus. We thank you that in the middle of life going crazy around us, that God, you are there, that you want good for us, you have a plan for us. So God, help us to stop reaching. Not because it's bad to want good relationships, not because it's bad to try to gather resources to provide, and not because it's bad to even appreciate and to want some of the things that we've seen previously in our life. But God, help us not to reach for those more than we reach for you. God, we love you. Keep our focus on you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.